Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our audience. Whenever you are, welcome to the E-Institute webinar series on emerging topics. I'm Xavier Canadell, Learning Specialist at the World Bank Institute, and today I will be your host. Today the topic of our webinar is on government support PPPs, and our speaker is Shamala Shukla. Governments have supported PPPs through a variety of instruments such as equity, debt, grants, guarantees, and contractual clauses pertaining to risk allocation. This webinar gives an overview of key instruments to support the pros and cons of using these, how and why governments use these instruments, and the prerequisites and precautions involved, along with project examples from different regions. Shamala Shukla, Senior Infrastructure, Finance and Public-Private Partnerships, will do the presentation. Before we start, a quick note. The presentation and the recording of the webinar will be available in 24 hours in our website. Now, without any further ado, it's over to our presenter.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to us for this webinar on government support to PPPs. This is a part of a series, as Xavier has already pointed out. We have a very talented audience for this webinar. I can see the numbers increasing as we have started this, and we would like to draw on this pool of expertise that we have with us today during our conversation. I hope we'll have a very interactive conversation. To begin with, let us take a quick look at some of the global trends in private participation to set the tone for our conversation, following which we will look at the structure of our webinar today. The private sector has made substantial investments in public infrastructure in the last couple of decades, and the figure that you see on the top left, which is based on the PPI database of the World Bank, shows cumulative investments in 4 key infrastructure sectors in the last 2 decades. And many of these investments are supported by governments through a variety of instruments. To give a few numbers, the UK government, this is the graph which you see on the top right. The UK government will be making unitary payments estimated at £7 to £10 billion annually to PFI projects in the next 15 years. The Government of India has committed grant financing of $3.38 billion to 178 projects between 2005 and 14. And the FONADIM in Mexico in just 4 years has committed almost 1.3 billion, and the number is increasing. I wanted to give you a few links, but unfortunately we can't do that now. So when we post the final presentation, I'll give you some links to the data so that you know about the trends of this. We will use this webinar to look briefly at some of these instruments and some examples of how governments are doing this. And the approach we will adopt today is fairly straightforward. While this is a topic with several ramifications and can be discussed at length for many hours, in this session we will look very briefly at government support in terms of 3 key components that practitioners should be familiar with: instruments, illustrations, and checklist. And the instruments of support, we will be looking under this topic about how countries are using these and some advantages and disadvantages of these. We will follow with illustrations of specific projects. We have 4 projects today for you. And the last section will consist of 2 checklists for practitioners who are working on structuring support to individual projects. This presentation will draw partly from ongoing and past work in the area of government support within the World Bank, its key client countries, and in some other organizations globally. The slide shows a list of these pieces of work that we have been involved in, and these relate to specific sectors as well as overall frameworks for government support. Before we go on to a discussion of these key instruments of support, let's talk a little bit about myth busting. I have often been asked which is the best instrument of support and which subtype among these instruments would be good. And the idea we need to understand before we go on to structuring support for PPP projects is that there is no best or worst in terms of instrument, structuring, or even framework, which can be generic to all projects. We need to match the instruments with the risk and revenues. I always say follow the revenues and the risk. and look at projects and portfolios each time that you have to do this. As we will see in the illustrations, multiple instruments may sometimes be used to cater to different problems. Having said that, however, we would need to be aware of some of the inherent strengths and weaknesses of instruments and the big picture in terms of frameworks of support. In the current slide and the next few slides, we will look at the key instruments of government support, beginning with equity. Equity support could be provided through direct shareholding in specific projects or through investment in equity funds, an example being the Funabin investment in projects, as well as funds like the MMIF. We also have the quasi-equity instrument, which is actually quite useful and includes sub-equity. Mezzanine and subordinate debt instruments are also sometimes classified as quasi-equity with a hierarchy in repayment that is just about pure equity, an example being Funabin's sub-equity instrument, which allows investment up to 50% in a project and receives returns only when the IRR exceeds certain projected levels. And why do governments use equity? Sometimes it might be a requirement due to the existing sector framework or PPP framework, or it could be a strategic decision based on uncertainties in project revenues. Equity allows governments to share in revenues, especially when there's a potential for an upside. And if you see the PF2 document of the UK government, you would see that they identified the perception that PPPs are making windfall profits as one of the key weaknesses, and there was no way that the government could tap into these upsides. The PF2, if you see it, prescribes equity participation by government, typically about 20%, but up to a maximum of 49% where it is required. Government of India too has strategic 26% equity investments in its airport projects. Equity can also help to maintain public and political support. The government has a stake there. And I had an opportunity to meet with one of the CEOs of a major airport in India, and I asked him if government equity in his SPV bothered him at all, and he replied that in fact it has facilitated improved interactions with all the public entities and has added immense value to the way his entity is functioning. With a public sector person on the board of the SPV, there's also greater scope for involvement in decision making as well as more disclosure of information. On the other side, the government equity in a PPP can pose a corporate governance challenge because you have government on both the sides, the concessionaire as well as the other side, which is the authority side. And the private sector might sometimes add a premium based on apprehensions of unwarranted government interference through this equity position. And for the government also, where there's a lack of capacity, it might be very difficult for, to handle equity in a large number of projects across sectors. We now go on to debt, which is a very key instrument of support, and we see that this is being used increasingly in many governments as a way to match repayments with revenues of projects also. Governments can provide direct loans to SPVs, or it could be through a variety of ways. Senior mezzanine or subordinate debt are very common, and these can help projects when there's a lack of liquidity in the market, or to increase the tenor of the loan or to lower rates of interest. Loans could also be in the form of revenue shortfall loans, and we see these especially in national highway projects in India. And these loans usually kick in when the project revenues temporarily go down. Takeout financing is another instrument governments are increasingly using, mostly to enhance the term. Investments in specialized debt funds, this is an example which you will see that has emerged recently in India. And this is helpful because the debt funds come in after construction, where the major risk of the project is over, and when the revenues start coming in, and when the projects need long tenure debt, and they come up, and they also free up space for issuance of additional debt to commercial financiers. And loans with customized repayment schedules could be created to match the pattern of revenues of the project, like, for example, using long moratoriums, balloon repayments, etc. If you look at the Treasury Infrastructure Finance Unit loans that were provided a few years ago, there's an example of the Greater Manchester Waste Project where a loan was provided by the TIFU in the aftermath of the financial crisis. We have this example later on in our next section. Under its co-lending program, the UK government provides debt financing of up to 50% to projects, and You also have in the US now the TIFIA, or the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, where subordinated debt is being provided to projects, examples being the I-495 Capital Beltway Hot Links project in the Washington, D.C. metro area, which is one of amongst the new projects. You also have the FCT PPP of France, which issues infrastructure bonds for projects backed by service charge payments. We will also see an example of an interest-free loan later on in this presentation. Going on to grant support. Grants are actually a very popular way of providing support to projects which are not viable on their own. And it can be paid during construction in installments, or it could be paid over a longer period of time in the form of annuity payments or availability or usage-based payments. Availability payments are common in the UK, Australia, British Columbia, etc. Annuity payments, which are fixed annual payments, are mostly, they used to be very popular in national highway PPPs in India. Capital contributions during the construction period, which serve to lower upfront capital costs, are used in several countries: South Korea, Mexico, India, the UK, and US these days. Grants can be a very useful instruments for risk allocation, especially demand and revenue risks in a project, as well as a way to defer government expenditure over a longer period of time. Land rights are used, for example, permission to use land on nominal payment, or allowing the private sector entity to commercially exploit the land for revenues in certain projects. One of the examples that I can think of is the airport project in Hyderabad in India. And there are also examples of parallel public sector investments, and we have examples from the A2 motorway project, where a part of the investment was done solely on public procurement and a part was PPP. And usually these parallel public investments serve to increase the revenues or decrease the costs of both of the PPP project which is associated with it. Grants could, however, lead to long drawn-out fiscal commitments for countries, and there could be a certain amount of uncertainty associated with this, depending on what kind of budget process is used in the countries. And these could also expose governments. So proper precautions such as performance-based payments requiring investors upfront equity, performance guarantees, etc., are often taken to reduce performance risk for the government. And now we come to one of the most important and widely used instruments, guarantees. Guarantees can be extremely useful if used with a lot of caution. Guarantees can cover a range of risks, as you can see on the left of the slide, including credit risks such as for bond issuances and risk of potential payments by off-takers of the services. These are used mostly in the power sector. Foreign exchange, interest rate, revenue and political risks are also covered in, depending on what kind of country or project it is. The risk may be fully or partially covered. Usually it's the partial coverage, coverage of the first hit is taken by the government in several cases. Guarantees can provide key enhancements that ensure project closure with lower outlay than other instruments. For a grant, you have to spend a lot upfront, whereas for a guarantee, if the probability of the guarantee being called is low, you might end up spending nothing or very little, but then there's the risk. Some of the first guarantees that we know of, the government of Chile established guarantees for foreign debt in the 1990s, where domestic currency depreciation in excess of 10% was covered but was charged a specific premium. Government of Poland issued a guarantee of a face value of euro 800 million in an interest and principal deferred 17-year debt, and this was from the European Investment Bank in the Poland A2 motorway project. The government of Kenya issued a political risk guarantee into Rift Valley Railways in the famous Kenya-Uganda rail concession. The UK now has a guarantee scheme for projects, and if you go onto their website and look at it, you'll see the details of that. There's a recent example which we will take up in the next section of this UK guarantee scheme being used. And payment guarantees have been issued to IPPs in Pakistan. This was in the news recently. The other kind of guarantee is a fuel guarantee or steam guarantees, which are used for geothermal projects in Kenya. You are all aware of the revenue guarantees, which are very famous, issued in the Mexican toll road projects and MRGs in South Korea. These were discontinued later on. Guarantees, as you know, can lead to contingent liabilities that may sometimes lead to large fiscal impacts. Foreign exchange and interest rate guarantees, for example, you do not know how much this might move. There could be a huge depreciation, there could be a financial crisis, and those are the times these guarantees are actually meant to cover. But beyond a point, you cannot cover this. So governments are increasingly using caps for these, so that if variables move beyond a certain cap, then maybe it's better to go in for renegotiation rather than providing this kind of support. There could be several other forms of support. Government may offer fiscal incentives and has been offering incentives for a long while. You see this in many countries. There are tax exemptions on infrastructure bonds, tax exemption on expenditure on equipment which is purchased for infrastructure projects. Capital gains are exempt. Termination payments are another universal form of support that enable much of the infrastructure financing by commercial lenders globally by lowering the credit risk immensely or even eliminating it in certain cases. It's important, however, to structure the termination payments properly. Variable term contracts, where the contract term follows the project revenues, is another form of support that enables the government and the private provider to mitigate the demand risk to some extent. And we see the use of non-compete clauses frequently in many of the large infrastructure projects. We won't go into much detail on these forms of support, but these are definitely very, very important, and some of these do not really require expenditure on the part of the government. However, government has to be careful how it structures these. On trends, what is happening around the world now? On this slide and the next one, we have 13 examples of the use of government support from the UK, US, India, Senegal, South Korea, and Latin America. As you can see from these examples, recent trends have been towards use of multiple instruments for individual projects based on the identification of the various constraints and problems in the project. The combination of upfront and availability payments is often seen as also combining various types of debt with grants. So it's no longer having one type of support and then trying to pack all your projects or designing all your projects around it. More commonly, you now see that there's thinking around how to solve the problem that is associated with this project. Is it a liquidity problem or is it something else? We will be looking at 4 of these 13 projects in slightly more detail today in the next 4 slides. Coming to the first of our illustrations, the Hyderabad International Airport project in India, which closed around 2008. It was a greenfield project with uncertain revenues as well as a projected shortfall in revenues, and government had to use multiple instruments, that is equity, interest-free debt, grant financing, and land lease at a nominal cost in order to make this project bankable. As you can see, the interest-free loan has been issued by the government of Andhra Pradesh in this, and this has a very long moratorium of 16 years from the start date, and this helped push the part of the debt repayments of the project to later years. Grant financing helped plug the overall viability gap. And apart from the grant, debt and equity financing, other types of support provided to raise revenues and lower costs were approximately 5,000 plus acres of land for commercial exploitation and waiver of a host of taxes. Incidentally, it was the same group which was doing both the Delhi airport and the Hyderabad airport, and we had a chance to discuss these 2 projects with them at length, and they discussed how different these 2 airports were in terms of the revenue profile and why they had to use these different kinds of financing. And you see the graph which is on the lower right, this shows the debt financing for the project by a syndicate of banks, and the lowest bar is the state support, which is the interest-free loan, the long moratorium interest-free loan, which is a very, very interesting device which was being used. Our second example is the Mersey Gateway Bridge project in the UK, which closed, I think, last month. And it uses grant, guarantee, and availability payments. The variety of instruments used in the Mersey Gateway project can be linked to direct objectives of the government. The guarantee support of up to 50% of the senior debt of the project was to enable financial close in a not completely conducive environment of project finance in the UK and globally now, with commercial bank financing not expected to materialize, especially for projects with substantial construction or revenue risk. In this case, the demand or revenue risk being substantial. It is also part of the larger objectives of the UK government to reactivate the project finance market through the UK guarantee scheme. The support was considered essential for the project to obtain financing, given that the project continued to have an estimated 30% viability gap in its financial model, following the consideration of these support instruments. And there's an upfront grant which is paid at service commencement, and it is expected to cover a part of the upfront costs to the private provider, reducing the total project cost somewhat. In addition, you see this graph here, where a combination of how you compare the availability payments which are set at the time of the bid and the actual revenues that the project gets throughout the project life. The government bears the risk of any difference between the availability payment amount fixed at bid and the total revenues which will be used by the contracting authority, and in this case it was the Halton Borough Council to make the availability payments. The figure on the slide shows how this would work out at the time of revenue upsides or downsides. And you can also see why it creates contingent liabilities for the government. Recently, the UK government had issued a statement on contingent liabilities and had shown a picture where revenues could be zero and what that would mean for the government in terms of supporting the project. This is an older project which closed in April 2009, the Greater Manchester Waste Management Project. And this was very interesting because it was in the aftermath of the financial crisis and again had to use several instruments of support. Initially, you had just two banks, the Bank of Ireland and the NIBC, which were expected to be the financiers and each issuing 50% of the debt. But given the size of the project as well as the liquidity problems that were being faced during that time, it became necessary not only to involve a number of financiers, but the government had to support using the instruments of debt as well as grant financing. And you have senior debt and a capital contribution from the GMWDA in this, as well as a government TFU loan, which I had referred to earlier. And the project is also backed by the government and will receive PFI credits. So you can see multiple instruments here to make this project possible, and probably this would not have closed without the loan. And one major point to remember is that this support led to a revival of commercial financing in the PFI market in the UK. So government support to one project could spur, could have greater ramifications, which could be very useful. And in the UK, 13 other projects achieved financial close following this in close succession, but without the TFU loan. The idea is that debt support by government should be used only when there's a shortfall in commercial financing and should not crowd out or replace commercial financing. And therefore, it's always better that the terms and conditions of lending by the government, if government has to resort to it, should be to the extent possible the same as commercial financing. We now come to the last of our projects. This is a very differently structured project, Port of Miami Tunnel project. It does not levy any toll. It's in the United States and being developed as a PPP. The project uses multiple government support instruments, including fixed payments during construction, a final construction completion payment, and a TFIA. I spoke about TFIA a little while ago, subordinate loan, and also annual availability payments. And this goes over a 30-year period. The TFIA loan repayments are scheduled to begin only after completion of senior debt service in 2015. You can see that the senior debt was of very short tenure, and it is the TFIA loan which kicks in later on, and which remains for the longer period of time. And the availability payments are a way to support repayment of that loan. So we can see here that the government support has helped in structuring debt repayments based on revenue flows of the project. The project almost did not happen due to the financial crisis of 2008. It took quite some time to close. Initial equity providers for the project had also backed out. And with the disappearance of the monoline insurance market and the weakening of the private activity bond market, FDOT used the TFIA federal loan program for financing the project. You can go on to the website of the FDOT to get more details on this project and other projects which are similar, and of course about the TFIA To end our presentation now, we have the last two slides, and these are checklists which I always look at while looking at structuring any kind of government support or even looking at making frameworks for government support in countries. As PPP practitioners, we need to be aware that while assessing our options for the right kind of support for projects in our pipeline, it is essential to look at a whole host of factors that surround these projects. No instrument works in isolation. The choice as well as the results of an instrument that you use would be influenced by all of these factors that you see up there on the slide. These are some of the key points to look at in the policy, regulatory, institutional, fiscal, and financing space, among others, before you go on to looking at individual projects and designing the appropriate government support for them. It is not important that all of these should be there. Some of these could be missing and PPPs could be done irrespective. However, you have to assess the environment and it will help you in drafting of appropriate contract clauses and to fill in some of the missing gaps. For example, the market for financing and sector tariff policy could play a key role in driving revenues and costs for the project, which are crucial to the choice of instrument. An existing framework for management of fiscal commitments and contingent liabilities could help warn you whether government support being envisaged for a specific project would be affordable in the longer run or not. So these are part of the environment which could be helpful to your project, to your instrument of government support, or these could create trouble or pose impediments for you. So that's the reason you need to look at all of these and to be aware of all of these before you work on a project. And existing benchmarks for costs, for example could help to make the determination of viability gap somewhat easier than it usually is. So that's the kind of big picture that you should have in mind. And we'll go on to our second checklist. We have assessed the environment for PPPs now in checklist 1. We now come to checklist 2. After assessing the environment in which the project will be developed, procured, and implemented, individual projects would need to be assessed for support. Some key issues under project financials would be capex versus opex. That is how front heavy is the project, and the requirement to reduce the upfront costs would be something you can glean out of this. And the pattern of the debt service coverage ratio is always very important for the projects and the instrument of support that you would be using, and how you can change it and smooth it somewhat better with support. Demand analysis can be very important, especially when considering instruments like MRGs or availability payments. Debt market liquidity is perhaps one of the most important points to look at, as a major part of the financing has to come from the commercial banks or from the capital markets, irrespective of whatever support you have. And you will have to design your support in a manner that it makes it possible for the project to get financing from the commercial lenders. And governments might sometimes need to issue guarantees to make this happen. And the guarantee should be optimum, and for this reason you need to know exactly where your project is going with the financing. Other issues to cover would be the availability of risk capital, how interested and attracted are investors towards your project. And the trends in macroeconomic variables cannot be emphasized more. Even if you are having a stable kind of a situation, it's always good to look at these and to have some kind of plugs inside your contract so that these don't get out of hand and don't pose a problem for you later on. Having talked about instruments and examples and checklists, all practitioners need to remember one word, that is caution. We need to ask ourselves the following questions. With all of the government support, does the project still provide value for money, or is it less costly to do it as a publicly procured project? You need to be almost sure of this answer, if not completely sure. Is the project affordable to government over the longer term in terms of the fiscal commitments and contingent liabilities, which I have already referred to? Have we used adequate protection in terms of performance guarantees, upfront equity, etc.? Because after all, finally we need to have the performance of the service at the standards agreed to from the private sector. And we should see to it that the support we are providing and uses adequate protection to make this continue to happen as the project is implemented. Is there still some possibility of there being perverse incentives coming into the project or arising due to the kind of government support that you have given to this project? such as lack of proper due diligence because of credit or revenue guarantees, which is a most common complaint. And we heard this quite a bit in the context of the Korean MRGs and so on. So these are four cautions or four, I would say, questions that you should ask yourself. We now come to the end of the presentation, and you will have a chance to ask questions. I will try to answer as many questions as time permits, but let's now begin with some of our own questions for you.
Thank you, Shamila, for this fantastic presentation. I've been quite busy with the chat. There is a lot of discussion, have already quite a lot of questions, and we will try to address as soon as we can. First of all, just to remind our audience that the presentation, the recording of this webinar will be available in 24 hours on our website, as well other recordings from previous webinars. So if you go to the Institute website, you will find under webinar series all the recordings of the entire series of webinars that we have here. So as Shamila said, the first thing we will do is to move to poll questions. We already prepared some questions and we want to know your opinion about them. So the first question is, which instrument of government support could be used to structure risk in a long-term PPPs contract for greenfield project where the revenue are highly uncertain? We will wait for a couple of 10 seconds or so to allow you to vote. Then we will block the questions and we will wait for Shamila to comment on the answers. Things are moving, but it seems that option A is the winner. Okay, I'm going to block here. I think more or less we have the idea. Letter A, sorry.
Yeah. So for this, actually, I should warn you that we are asking you for optimum answers. Sometimes there's no correct answer, and for this particular question, senior debt and subordinate debt are useful, right? But when it's a question of highly uncertain revenues and the government doesn't know what to do, sub-equity is actually a very good kind of support instrument to use. But then quasi-equity also includes subordinate debt. So senior debt would not be the right question, but part of that, the choice over there, subordinate debt would also come in. And sub-equity is a good instrument because it can be, as you have seen in the case of the FONA, then it could be used as a grant, getting no returns, or it could be used as a, something which provides you returns in case of the upside. So I would probably go with C as the better and optimum answer, but part of A, subordinate debt, would also be very useful.
Okay, let's move to the second one. We are on time. The second question is, what was the apprehension of the UK government while using TIFU, which resulted in very cautious use of it, and what was the mitigating feature they used for this risk? Waiting for your answers.
I think we'll get it totally right. This probably has just one answer.
Okay, I'm gonna block here.
Absolutely. This question actually has just one answer, and you hit the nail on the head, I should say. They were afraid of crowding out commercial financing, and therefore they made sure that loans were on commercial terms, and that was the only single loan, the one which was to the waste management, Greater Manchester Waste Management Project.
Okay, let's move to the third one. Which is the best way to use the debt instrument for a project with high UPFR?
upfront costs.
Sorry, upfront costs, but will back-end revenues. Okay, it seems that everyone quite clear. Option B.
Yeah, everyone is with option B. Actually, we could have A, B, C, all three. All three have this effect of helping delay the repayments, long moratorium debt, as we saw in the case of the Hyderabad International Airport. It smooths over the repayments so that it pay later on. And debt with balloon repayments again has the same effect. And short-term debt during construction, sold to debt funds at the end of construction also helps quite a bit in smoothing out your repayments, because you then start matching the revenue expectations of those debt funds with your own revenue. So it's a good way to do it. All three would be the right answer.
Okay, fourth and last one. Availability payments fixed through bid with a contract clause for tolling, but with the government making up for a shortfall in toll, has the effect of credit guarantee, traffic guarantee, performance guarantee, or revenue guarantee. Numbers are moving quite fast.
Yeah. We're moving in the right direction.
Okay, we're gonna stop here.
Great, wonderful. Yes, this was the graph we used for the Mercy Gateway project. It has the effect of revenue guarantee. Revenue is fully guaranteed to the private party in such a case.
Okay. Well, now we will move to open questions. As I said before, we already have a bunch of them, but please use the chat pod to let us know your questions. Also, I'm gonna make the presentation available, so right now you can check, you can navigate through the presentation while we discuss and we answer all these questions. So the first question that we got was from Olaniyan. He or she says, hello Shukla, will this presentation be a continuous exercise for government support to PPPs?
Yeah, if I get you right, this presentation is part of our work, the work that we are doing on government support to PPPs. So it's a continuing exercise for us here at the World Bank, and it's actually a lot of work that is being done by governments. So I think this would be, a continuing exercise if you mean it that way.
Another question from Marcia Lin. Is it possible to find out what the PPPs projects are currently underway in the USA? Who may we contact for this information?
I suggest you first look at the website of the Federal Department of Transportation. They have got a number of projects there. They have information on the TPR loan and some of the state governments, which are the states are also have their own websites. So please look at that. But go to the F. and then you'll be directed to all of these.
And then, I guess from New Delhi, does this use of multiple instruments in one concession not make the structure complex? Is it not advisable to keep the structure simple by converting all risk into cost?
Yeah, that's a legitimate question. You have to think of that whenever you structure projects. And being in India, as you know, India did decide to convert everything into costs and do the VGF viability gap financing and give upfront support rather than having all of these multiple instruments. But sometimes VGF does not work, especially if it's a project which has all of these complications, which has a problem in the market. And later on, the government of India has run into a bit of a problem with the national highway projects, as you see, and VGF is not quite working all that well. So sometimes where you don't have that kind of uniformity in the projects themselves, and they present special problems where it is difficult, to find out how to cost the risk. It is not always easy. For example, your traffic numbers might be so much, uncertain. You really don't know what turns out. So it's better then to go in for either availability payments or some kind of a guarantee or some other support instrument which is, in there rather than a VGF costing all the risk into one grant or one number. That sometimes doesn't work.
Marcia Lin asks, may we get additional information on the main tunnel project, please? We're in Florida and we would like more information.
I suggest you go onto the FDOT website again, the TIFIA website, TIFIA, and if you type FDOT and TIFIA, you go to that in your browser, so in a Google search, and you can be directed to the project website, which gives you all the information, and also the 2 or 3 local governments which are involved in this also have their information on that.
Gancho Kolasabov asks, can you introduce us an example of PPP's municipal projects?
Yeah, PPPs have been actually used in municipal projects for a long time in different ways. The entire spectrum of PPPs, from management contracts to leases to full PPPs, and solid waste is one area where municipal councils all over have been using this. And you have a lot of examples from India of municipal projects, and it's very interesting that you should ask this question, because we have now commenced some work inside the World Bank on the small PPPs, which are done at subnational levels and mostly at the municipal level. And we are looking at these. You could have projects like solid waste, water projects. Indonesia has a couple of examples of water projects at municipal level, local body level. And you can also have even smaller projects like, for example, parking spaces or upkeep, maintenance, and implementation of parks, gardens, and other such attractions within the municipal area. And there could be even many other services. For example, the municipalities in some of the countries do provide some small hospital or outpatient services. So those could also be done under PPPs where they are not working out in the conventional sense. So yes, we could have a whole host of services which can be done through PPPs in the municipal level. So check out water projects in Indonesia, and you'll hit a lot with your Google search.
Anand from New Delhi, when should the BFM analysis should be conducted? Before deciding on the contracting strategy or after the receipt of bids?
Now, before that, actually, receipt of bids, that becomes too late. Some people do it both times. And after receiving the bid, it makes sense to do a VFM, because then you'll know the costs that are entailed for you, the price that the bid has brought in front of you. Would that, if you go with that, would that give you value for money? So it's usually done at 2 stages, before and after. And it also helps you to structure by taking some hypothetical figures in the beginning, and then after that, after the bid, you get the actual figures, and it helps you to see if you're getting VFM in the project at that price.
He's also asking about more reliable source of VFM literature.
I think you should go on to the website of the government of UK, Infrastructure UK, and it's a part of the government now. They have some good materials, and Partnerships Victoria has good material on that, and New South Wales also has some good literature on that. You could go to these websites and look up these, and then there's also a publication. What we will do is, I have a few links which I unfortunately couldn't paste into the chat box now. I was planning to do that, and what we'll do is, when we put up within 24 hours, as Chavi has promised, when we put up the PowerPoint presentation, I'll try to have a slide, last slide with all of these links, and we have recent publications on how countries are doing VFM. This is from the World Bank itself.
This also links us to the next question. Elizabeth Fateo, she's asking if you can share by email the checklist, or all this available as a Word or PDF. As you said, all this information is in the PDF, in the PPT. In this presentation, we will add these links, and we will share with everyone this presentation. She is asking additionally, can you talk about non-technical risk and how you approach to handle?
Well, this is right now outside the scope of this presentation, but environmental risks, okay, let us talk about the social risk of a project, or the environmental risk of a project. It's very important to look at these initially, because these can be, it's not just a question of the cost. These risks could definitely increase the cost for the concessionaire as well as the government. And we have seen that these environmental risks are shared in different ways. I have seen projects where it's partly shared by the government, in the sense that whatever, for example, the site, whatever environmental factors might come up later on, which were not known at the time of the signing of the agreement, and these were pre-existing, the government tries to take up part of the risk, and it's also the way it should be, because you cannot expect the private party to bear risks of a government site, which were pre-existing issues which were not in the knowledge of either the government or the private party. So there could be various ways of sharing this risk, but governments need to bear a part of it, especially as far as pre-existing risks are concerned.
Okay. The chat has a lot of questions. Next one is Stephanie Charvid. Thank you for insightful presentation. Many projects are quite complex in terms of arranging multiple financing instruments from various providers. What role do usually play financial advisors, and do balance sheet capabilities help to secure advisory positions?
Well, balance sheet capabilities are very important. You should know how to, read a balance sheet, make sense of it, but probably it requires larger knowledge of what is happening in the project finance market, and a lot of experience in order to be able to secure advisory positions, as you say.
Vijay asks, what should be the basis of termination payments, as sometimes it's easy for the private player to terminate the project?
Yes. Termination payments can result in perverse incentives sometimes, so these have to be, termination events, etc., have to be very carefully crafted. I will also add another slide so that your question is answered more totally. I have a slide on termination payments and how these have been used in various governments. Usually these cover a part or whole of the debt that is outstanding, and sometimes a part of the equity too, depending on the kind of project it is. And you will have to structure it differently when it's a BOO project or a BOT project, and whether the project reverts to the public entity after termination, or it remains with the private entity, and what uses can it be put to once this use is over. So there are various ways of structuring it. I'll add a slide to the presentation to make that very clear to you.
Fantastic. We want to thank the audience. We have so many questions and we don't have time to address all of them. So we have 4 more minutes. Let's try to catch up with a few of them.
Okay.
Maria Elisa Antinero, is the agricultural sector viable for PPPs arrangement?
Yeah, it depends on what you're looking at. It's very interesting that you should ask this question. We are working on reviewing the current experiences in a type of agriculture, PPPs. I wouldn't say we are looking at the entire spectrum, but storage, cold chain, these are very important, the logistics part of it. So, for example, we are now from the World Bank looking at grain PPPs, public-private partnerships, grain storage PPPs. There are examples of these in quite a few countries. India has a few examples. The Food Corporation of India has started a large program of PPPs in grain storage, and you have a couple of examples from states in India. On the other hand, you also have public-private partnerships. Like the government is trying right now to concession out storage um, areas that it already has for rehabilitation and development of the private sector. So storage would be very important, and in the cold chain area also, cold chain storage also, governments are looking at PPPs. So I think that would be one area which would be very amenable in agriculture to PPPs.
Kong Hua is asking how much share of government support for waste and wastewater projects should be.
Well, that's a do you see waste and wastewater both? Yeah, waste and wastewater. That's a very good question. And there is no right answer for that. People have been struggling with the caps, issue of caps. How much should we give as grant financing, upfront grant financing? What should be the maximum support that you give? The right answer, which is actually very difficult in practice to find out, is that you should know whether after giving a certain amount of support, does the project continue to provide value for money as it is after you've, for example, given 50% grant? Does it still provide you value for money the way you're doing it? That would be one of the things to look at. And the other thing to look at is, you can't have a number, 40%. I have seen several solid waste management projects which do not fit into the 40%, which, for example, the government of India has. It requires much more. And for these projects, waste and wastewater, it's also a matter of, the geographical area, whatever is the density of the population, what kind of, municipal level, I would say, factors. There are so many factors that are there. The way the land is, there might be hilly areas, there might be very sparsely populated areas. You might have to cover all of these, or there could be scattered hamlets or scattered areas, and there might be a big utility doing all of these. So the costs definitely vary. And we had in one of our examples, that was the Greater Manchester Waste Management Project. You can see, if you go back to that slide, you will see the amount of government support that it needed, and finally also availability payments. So even to get the financing, despite availability payments being there, it was very difficult. So you have to look at projects, individually in this, and I wouldn't be able to recommend a cap.
Well, thank you very much. Sadly, we don't have more time for more questions, even though we have we could have maybe 20 more minutes for answer questions. Anyway, before closing the webinar, I want to give you the opportunity to share your final thoughts with our audience.
Thank you so much for being with us today, and we had a great audience and great questions. Certainly I would have liked to be on this for longer and interact with you, but unfortunately this is all that is possible today. But I would be happy to have any questions later on, and we will add an email address in case you'd like to share any experiences from your side on municipal PPPs, or you would like to ask more questions on any other issue. Thank you so much. And before leaving, I would just say that if you are working on any project or government support, remember the 4 questions that I posed in the end, which I said were very important, the cautions. These you should always be aware of, even if you're very gung-ho about any project or any form of government support or any PPP. PPPs can go wrong anytime, and as government, if you're supporting them, you should always be aware that you are exposed to a large extent. And you have an interest in the project surviving, but then you also have an interest in protecting the government to the extent possible. It's the taxpayers' money you're using, so use it carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamala. Thank you to our audience for your participation, for all your questions or your comments. As we discussed a couple of times already in the webinar, presentation and the recording of this webinar will be available on our website. Here on the screen you have the address. You will receive also quite soon an email with the same information, so for you to access to recordings and presentation faster. That's it. Thanks again. Have a wonderful day, afternoon, or night, wherever you are. Goodbye.